If you hunt, you already know the feeling. You're climbing to the stand before first light, headlamp on, cold air in your lungs, and something about the spot just feels right. The wind is wrong for every other location on the ridge, but somehow perfect here. The sign is everywhere. Rubs, scrapes, tracks. The shooting lane is clean and open and positioned exactly the way it should be, like the land itself arranged it for you. Everything in you says, this is the spot. This is where it's going to happen. You settle in and you wait, and the darkness thins, and the woods come alive around you, and you are absolutely certain, with the specific, hard-won certainty of someone who has been doing this a long time, that you are in the right place. Most of the time, that feeling is reliable. Most of the time, that feeling is 30 years of experience telling you something true. But there is a stand on the backside of the Hardwood Ridge above Combs Creek in Wythe County, Virginia, that gives every hunter who climbs into it that exact feeling. Every detail is perfect. The wind, the sign, the lane, the position. Everything your experience tells you to trust is telling you to trust this stand. 3 hunters trusted it. 2 of them don't hunt anymore. 1 of them is in the ground. A man named Cole Dressler found it on the last day of buck season. He was an experienced hunter, 22 years in these mountains. He knew the ridge above Combs Creek better than he knew his own backyard. He had never seen the 13th Stand until it found him. This is the 13th Stand. Virginia, blood and bone. Don't climb into it. The Hardwood Ridge above Combs Creek is not a secret. Hunters in Wythe County had been working that ridge for as long as anyone can trace. The same families, the same terrain, the same deer patterns passed from father to son the way all serious hunting knowledge passed in this part of the mountains, slowly, by example, over years of shared mornings in the dark and the cold. The ridge runs roughly north-south for about 2 miles above the creek bottom, the east slope dropping steeply to the water, and the west slope opening into the mixed timber and clear cuts of the state forest boundary. The deer used the creek bottom for water and the east slope for bedding, and the ridge itself as a travel corridor, moving between the bedding cover and the agricultural fields 3 miles to the north, and they had been doing it long enough that the trails were worn deep into the hillside. 12 stand locations. That was the number every hunter who worked the ridge knew, because every good stand location on that ridge had been found and built and used and rebuilt and passed on, and by the time Cole Dressler started hunting at 20 years old, his father already had maps showing all 12 spots with notes on wind direction and optimal entry routes and the times of day each one was most productive. 12 was a complete number for that ridge. The terrain was fully understood. The deer patterns were known. You hunted the 12 stands, and the ridge gave up what it was going to give up, and that was the work and the pleasure of it. And there was nothing on that ridge that could surprise a man who had hunted it for 22 years. Cole Dressler believed that. He was wrong. The last day of buck season was a Saturday in early December, cold and overcast, the kind of flat gray sky that sat on the ridge like a lid and muffled sound and made the light come up slowly and without color. Cole had hunted every day of the season and had passed on 3 does and a small 6-point and had not tagged out, which was not unusual and was not distressing. He was not the kind of hunter for whom tagging out was the point. The point was the ridge and the cold and the particular quality of attention that the woods required, and the specific pleasure of being the only person awake in the world at 4:30 in the morning in the timber above Combs Creek. He had planned to hunt Stand 7, the saddle stand, the one his father had called the money stand, where the ridge pinched between 2 drainages and every deer on the east slope eventually funneled through. Good wind for a northwest approach, consistent sign all season. If it was going to happen on the last day, it would happen at Stand 7. He parked at the pull-off on the county road, shouldered his pack, and started up the ridge in the dark. He had climbed this approach 100 times. He could have done it without the headlamp. He had gone about 3/4 of a mile, crossing the first drainage and climbing the switchback to the upper bench when he stopped. Something was wrong with the timber to his left. Not wrong in a threatening way, Wrong in the way that something familiar was suddenly different, the way a room looked wrong when you came home and couldn't identify why, and then realized a piece of furniture had been moved. He had walked this approach 100 times, and the timber to his left on the upper bench had always been a solid wall of second-growth oak and poplar with no opening in it for 50 yards until the bench turned north. There was an opening, a narrow gap between two large oaks, barely wide enough for a man with a pack to turn sideways and slip through, and beyond it, the faintest suggestion of a trail, not a deer trail, wider than that, the width of a human walking, leading back into the timber. Cole stood at the gap for a moment. He knew this bench. There was no trail there. He checked his watch. An hour and 10 minutes before first light. Enough time. He went through the gap. The trail ran back into the timber for about 60 yards, curving slightly south, descending maybe 10 feet of elevation to a natural bench cut into the hillside by some old geological event. A flat shelf of ground roughly 30 feet wide and twice as long, tucked below the main ridge crest with a view down the east slope that was, Cole would later say, the single best deer vantage point he had ever seen on this ridge. He had never known it existed. That alone should have been enough to stop him. 22 years on this ridge. His father's notes going back 40 years before that. This bench should not have been unknown. He stood at the edge of it with his headlamp, and he looked at what was on it. The stand was built into a large white oak at the back of the bench, set about 14 feet off the ground. The platform was solid, 2x6 lumber, not plywood, the kind of construction that was built to last. The steps screwed into the tree were the old strap and spike style, the metal gone dark with age and oxidation. The safety rail around the platform was made from branches rather than lumber, bent and lashed, the kind of construction that predated the hardware store era of stand building. The whole thing was old, not recently old. Old in the way that something in the woods got old when it had been sitting in weather for decades, when the wood had taken on the color and texture of the surrounding bark, when the hardware had corroded to the point that it was more a suggestion of metal than metal itself. Cole put his hand on one of the step spikes and pulled. Solid, not a wobble, not a creak. Whatever else this stand was, it was structurally sound. He looked at the shooting lane. The lane ran north-northeast from the stand, about 60 yards long and 12 feet wide, the shooting corridor maintained, and it had been maintained. The brush on either side was cut and cleared, not naturally absent, with a precision that put it exactly on the most logical deer travel line from the creek bottom bedding cover to the northern feed fields. It was a perfect lane. Not approximately perfect, not good enough perfect, the kind of perfect that experienced hunters recognized as the product of deep knowledge of a specific piece of terrain, the knowledge of where the deer wanted to go before the knowledge of how to put a lane there. Cole stood at the base of the stand and looked down that lane in the beam of his headlamp and felt, with 30 years of experience behind the feeling, that if he climbed into that stand and waited, something was going to come down it. He climbed into the stand. He settled in at 4:52, 12 minutes before legal shooting light, and he turned off the headlamp and let his eyes adjust, and he waited. The woods came up the way they always came up, the darkness thinning slowly from black to charcoal to the flat gray of an overcast December dawn. The shapes of trees resolving out of the dark one by one, the lane materializing ahead of him as the light built. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary pre-dawn silence that every hunter knew. That was never truly silent, always threaded through with the sounds of a forest restarting itself after dark, the first birds, the squirrels, the distant percussion of a woodpecker finding its morning rhythm. This was a different silence, a silence with a quality to it. A silence that felt less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something that had displaced sound. Cole had sat in a lot of deer stands over 22 years. He had felt the woods go quiet when a predator moved through. He had felt the specific hush that preceded a buck. that charged electric stillness when everything in the forest simultaneously recognized that something dominant was moving. This silence was not that. This silence was older and more complete. He put his hand on his rifle. At 6:41, with the light fully up and the flat gray sky making the lane ahead of him visible in complete detail, Cole saw the first deer, a doe, young, healthy-looking, moving from south to north along the edge of the lane with the careful, head-up alertness of a deer that had been spooked and was moving faster than her natural pace. Not running, walking fast, each step placed with the deliberate care of an animal that was paying attention to something behind her. She passed through the lane in under 10 seconds without slowing and disappeared into the timber to the north. Cole watched her go. Deer moving fast, heading away from something, classic sign of something pushing from behind. He settled the rifle across his knee. His thumb found the safety. His breathing slowed to the long, controlled rhythm of a man who had been in this moment many times before and knew how to be ready for it. At 6:48, another doe came through, faster than the first, head low, not feeding, not browsing, moving, the look of an animal that had made a decision about direction and was committed to it. At 6:52, a third doe, running, full run, not the bounding gait of a startled deer, but the flat, ground-eating sprint of an animal in genuine flight. She crossed the lane in 2 strides and was gone. Cole lowered the rifle slightly. 3 does in 11 minutes, each one moving faster than the last, all heading north, all clearly pushing from whatever was working the south end of that lane. He had seen deer pushed by predators before, bobcats, coyotes, once a bear on a ridge in Grayson County. He knew what pushed deer looked like. He also knew that whatever was pushing these deer had not made a sound. The silence had not broken. Whatever was working the south end of that lane was moving through the timber without a footfall, without a snap of a branch, without the breathing of something large and alive in cold air. Cole raised the rifle. He put his eye to the scope. He watched the south end of the lane. It came at 7:04. It came from the south end of the lane, stepping out of the timber with the unhurried, deliberate movement of something that had no reason to be cautious, the movement of something that was, in this place, the apex of whatever hierarchy existed here. It was a buck. Cole's eye found it in the scope, and his brain said buck, and his finger moved to the trigger guard, and his body performed all the automatic preparatory actions of a man who had been in this moment many times over 22 years. Then his brain caught up, and he moved his eye from the scope, and he looked at it with his naked eye, and he lowered the rifle. He described what he saw to me twice, 6 months apart, and both times he used almost exactly the same words, which told me he had spent a great deal of time between those conversations trying to find the most accurate language for something that did not fit cleanly into any language he had. He said, "It was a buck. Everything about it was a buck. The body, the legs, the color, the way it moved through the lane. The antlers were the largest he had ever seen on this ridge, massive, the kind of rack that lived in a hunter's imagination as the thing they were really waiting for, the culmination of 22 years of sitting in the cold before dawn." He said, "But the proportions were wrong. Not dramatically, not impossibly, just slightly wrong, in a way that took him a moment to identify because his eye kept wanting to resolve the wrongness into something normal. The legs were a fraction too long. The neck was a fraction too thick. The angle of the head as it moved down the lane was a few degrees off from the way a deer held its head." He said, "And the antlers were wrong. Not the size. The size was extraordinary, but not impossible. The way the antlers sat. They were too still. A live deer's antlers moved with the animal, the micro-sway of something attached to a living head, attached to a living body. These antlers did not move. They were fixed, rigid, as if they were part of something that was not quite alive in the way that required sway." He said, "I had it in the scope, at 40 yards, perfect broadside shot, everything I'd been waiting for on the last day of season, and I took my eye off the scope, and I looked at it,
and I put the rifle down on my knee, and I just sat there. "Why?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it knew I was there," he said. "It wasn't spooked, it wasn't surprised. It walked down that lane knowing exactly where I was sitting, and it wasn't spooked. And that's not a deer. A deer that knows you're in a stand and walks towards you anyway is not a deer." He said, "It stopped at 25 yards, directly in front of the stand, and it stood there and it looked up at him." He said, "It looked at him the way something looked at you when it wanted you to understand that it was aware of you. Not the fixed, glassy look of a deer that had spotted movement and was trying to resolve it. The specific, directed, intelligent look of something that knew exactly what it was looking at." He said, "It looked at me for a long time, and I looked at it, and I didn't shoot. And I can't explain why I didn't shoot. My rifle was in my hands. The shot was right there, 25 yards. I've made that shot 1,000 times. But I sat there, and I held the rifle, and I didn't shoot, and I looked at it, and it looked at me, and there was something happening in that exchange that I am not able to describe to you. Something being communicated, something I understood but could not tell you the content of." I asked him what it felt like. He thought about it for a long time. "Like I had trespassed," he said. "Like I had climbed into something I had no right to be in. Like whatever had built that stand and cleared that lane had not built it for me."
The thing in the lane stood at 25 yards for what Cole estimated was 4 full minutes. He did not look away. It did not look away. The rifle was in his hands, and the shot was there, and he did not take it. Then it walked back down the lane. Not spooked. Not the flag up, crashing exit of a deer that had finally caught your scent or your movement. A deliberate, unhurried withdrawal, the same way it had come in, each step placed with that same, slightly wrong precision. It reached the south end of the lane and stepped back into the timber, and was gone. The silence broke almost immediately after it disappeared. A squirrel of the canopy above, then birds, then the distant sound of the creek below, all of it returning at once as if whatever had been holding the forest in that suspended quiet had simply switched off. Cole sat in the stand for another 20 minutes. He did not see another deer. At 8:30, he climbed down. He stood at the base of the white oak, and he looked at the lane, and he looked at the stand, and he looked at the trail leading back to the bench opening. Then he did the thing that he would later tell me he was most ashamed of. He looked at the ground under the stand. He looked at the lane. He looked at the south end of the lane where the thing had stepped out and stepped back in. No tracks. Not a single impression in the soft December ground. Cole had hunted this ridge for 22 years. He knew what ground looked like after a large deer had walked through soft December soil. He knew the depth and definition of a mature buck track, the way the dew claws registered in soft ground, the way the weight of a large animal compressed the soil around the hoof. The ground was unmarked. He walked the full length of the lane, both edges, the entry point at the south end where it had stepped out of the timber. Nothing. A deer that left no tracks. He went back to the stand and he put his hand on the bottom step spike and he looked up at the platform. He thought about the 3 hunters who had sat in it before him. He had heard the stories the way everyone who hunted the ridge above Combs Creek had heard the stories. Vaguely, second-hand, the way you heard things that people didn't quite want to tell directly. 3 hunters. None of them would say what they saw. 2 don't hunt anymore. The 3rd in the ground. He had dismissed those stories the way experienced hunters dismissed most stories about the ridge. Because the ridge was known. Because 12 stands was a complete number. Because there was nothing on that ridge he hadn't seen. He put his hand in his pocket and found his phone and took a photograph of the stand. Then the lane. Then the south end of the lane where the thing had stepped out of the timber. He walked back through the gap in the oaks to the main trail. He went to stand 7 and he sat the rest of the morning
and he did not see a deer. He drove home without speaking to anyone.
He spent 2 weeks after the season trying to find information about the stand and what it had shown him. He found 3 things. The first was in the county deed records. The parcel that contained the bench and the stand was an odd-shaped piece of ground, a narrow strip running up the east slope of the ridge, roughly 2 acres, that had been carved out of a larger tract in 1891 and had changed hands only twice in the 130 years since. The original grantee was listed as a family name that Cole did not recognize. The current owner was a landholding company based in Roanoke that owned dozens of similar odd parcels across the county and appeared to do nothing with any of them. When Cole called the company, he was told, politely, that the parcel was not for sale and not available for any use, and that he should not return to it. He asked how they knew he had been there. The woman on the phone said, "We always know when someone finds the stand, Mr. Dressler." Then she said, "You're lucky you didn't shoot. The ones who shoot don't come home." She hung up. He called back. The number had been disconnected. The second thing he found was a reference in a local history of Wythe County published in 1962, a self-printed volume that he found at a used bookstore in Wytheville. The relevant passage described an 1891 transaction in which a wealthy landowner had subdivided part of his ridge property at the specific request of, and for the benefit of, what the author called a local tradition of considerable antiquity. The passage was opaque. The author clearly knew more than he was saying, but Cole read it 3 times and came away with the understanding that the narrow parcel with the stand on it had been set aside not as hunting ground, but as something closer to a sanctuary, a protected place, a place where something lived that had always lived there and that the local families had understood, for as long as there had been local families, was not to be disturbed. The stand had not been built for hunters. It had been built to bring hunters there, so that whatever used the lane could look at them, so that it could choose. The third thing Cole found was the simplest and the worst. He had photographs on his phone, the stand, the lane, the south end of the lane. He looked at the photographs the evening after his conversation with the Roanoke company, and he saw something in them he had not noticed before, because he had not been looking for it. In the photograph of the south end of the lane, the timber edge where the thing had stepped out and stepped back in, there was something in the trees. Not the thing itself, not the wrong proportioned buck with the 2 still antlers. Something else. Something standing back in the timber, behind the entry point, barely visible in the shadows of the overlapping tree trunks in the flat December light. A man, or the shape of a man, standing very still in the timber, facing the stand, watching. Cole zoomed in. The shape had no face he could resolve. The light was too poor and the distance too great and the timber too dense for anything definitive. But it was there, standing in the shadows at the back of the timber at the south end of the lane, watching the stand, watching Cole in the stand while the thing walked the lane. Cole looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he thought about the 3 hunters who had sat in the stand before him. He thought about the one who was in the ground. He thought about what the woman on the phone had said, "The ones who shoot don't come home." He thought about the moment in the stand when the thing looked up at him and he had not shot. He had not shot. He put the phone down. He did not delete the photographs, but he has not looked at them again. Cole Dressler still hunts. He hunts the ridge above Combs Creek, 12 stands. He knows the ridge and the stands and the deer patterns and the wind directions and all 12 spots by name. He hunts them the way he has always hunted them, and the ridge gives up what it gives up, and that is the work and the pleasure of it. He has never gone back through the gap in the oaks. He passes it every time he climbs the bench trail and every time he glances at it, the narrow opening between the 2 large oaks, and every time he keeps walking. He told me that the opening is always there, never grown over, never changed. Whatever maintains it is maintaining it still.
He told me that twice, in the 2 seasons since, he has heard something moving in the timber on the other side of those oaks as he passed. Something large, moving parallel to his course, matching his pace, staying just out of sight. He does not stop. He does not look. He keeps his eyes on the trail ahead, and he walks at the same steady pace, and he passes the opening, and he keeps going. He told me, "I think it knows I came back. I think it knows I'm not going to go through that gap again. I think it's watching me walk past. Every time." "Why do you keep hunting the ridge?" I asked. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had asked himself that question many times and had arrived at an answer he was not entirely comfortable with, but had accepted. "Because the ridge is mine," he said. 22 years, my father before me. It's mine and I know it, and I'm not going to be pushed off it by something that lives in the timber and uses a stand to look at hunters." He paused. "I just don't go through that gap. The stand is there. Whatever uses that lane uses it. I don't need to know more than that." He said it the way people said things they had decided about. Settled. Final. "Does it scare you?" I asked, "knowing it's there, every time you're on the ridge?" He was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said. "Every single time I pass that gap, yes." He looked out the window. "But it scares me the right amount," he said. "The ridge should scare you a little. If you're paying attention, it scares you a little. That's how you know you're paying attention." He picked up his coffee. "Season opens in 3 weeks," he said. "Stand 7, first morning." He said it the way a man said, "The mountain is mine, and I am going back." I believed him. I also believed that something in the timber above Combs Creek, in a bench clearing that appeared on no modern survey, in a stand older than anyone alive, was already waiting, already watching the gap in the oaks, knowing he was coming, wondering perhaps whether this would be the season he went through it again.
The ridge above Combs Creek is still there. 12 stands, all known, all mapped, all hunted by the same families that have been hunting them for generations. And the 13th stand is still there too. Back in the timber, through a gap in 2 old oaks, on a bench that appears on no modern survey, solid as the day it was built. The lane is still maintained, the shooting corridor is still clear, and whatever walks that lane at dusk is still walking it. Most hunters who find that gap keep walking. Something in the back of the brain, 30 years of experience, or the older thing underneath experience, the thing that kept your ancestors alive in the dark, tells them to keep walking. Most hunters listen. If you ever find a stand you don't recognize, built into a tree you know well, on a ridge you've hunted for years, solid as the day it was built, old as the timber around it, facing a shooting lane that is more perfect than any lane has a right to be, don't climb into it. Whatever is using that lane is not afraid of you. It has never been afraid of you. It built the stand to look at you. And the ones who shoot don't come home. If the 13th stand found you somewhere dark tonight, good. Welcome to Virginia Blood and Bone, a new series of Appalachian hunting horror stories from the deep ridges and the old timber of Virginia's Blue Ridge. We are just getting started. More stories are coming, each one rooted in a different piece of the hunting tradition, each one built on the specific terror that lives in the woods when you're alone in the dark before dawn and something already knows you're there. Subscribe and hit the bell. You do not want to miss what's coming next. And leave me a comment. Have you ever found a stand on familiar ground that you had no explanation for? Have you ever been in the woods and felt with absolute certainty that something out there already knew exactly where you were sitting? I want to hear it. I read every one. Good hunting out there. Stay on the stands you know, and if the woods go completely silent, not the quiet of nothing moving, but the quiet of something making everything else stop, climb down. Come home. Whatever is about to come down that lane is not the deer you've been waiting for.